Picture this. London, mid-19th century, the 24th of December, and the city is wrapped in a cold so dense it feels almost alive. The fog crawls through the streets like a living thing, swallowing gas lamps until they glow as weak, drowning stars behind a veil of yellowed mist. You are walking alone along a narrow street off the Strand, your breath a faint ghost escaping your lips in pale, shivering clouds. The snow under your boots is not fresh and clean, but trampled to dirty slush, streaked with soot and something that looks disturbingly like old ash. Above you, the sky is a low, iron lid, pressing down on chimney pots and church spires, heavy with more snow that has not yet fallen. Behind the black glass of upper windows, candles move, stop, and disappear, as if someone is watching you pass and then steps back into the darkness. You pull your coat tighter around you, but the cold does not feel natural. It feels watchful. You know, of course, what Christmas is supposed to mean. You have been taught it is a season of light, of joy, of warmth, a time of music and comfort and overflowing tables and the soft glow of carols drifting through safe, bright rooms. You have been told Christmas is about family and gifts and the gentle miracle of a child in a manger. But that is the version wrapped in tinsel and printed on glossy cards, the version that soothes rather than disturbs. In Victorian England, the Christmas that lived in the marrow of the year was not gentle at all. It was a night that belonged to the dead, to regrets, and to things that refused to stay buried. This was not a time protected from darkness, but a time when darkness was invited in and given a chair by the fire. This is not the Christmas you think you know. This is not a story about jolly men in red cloaks and glass ornaments on evergreen branches, about clean, sentimental snow falling on happy couples beneath street lamps. This is the older story, the one about shadows that lengthen as the year dies, about the weight of unspoken fears, about the ghosts who choose this night to return and knock softly at the windows of the living. Before we step fully into that darkness, before we sit down at the hearth beside these long, forgotten Victorians, I want to ask something of you. If you believe that the colder, stranger truths behind our familiar celebrations deserve to be remembered, if you feel that the ghosts of history deserve more than silence, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support keeps the candle lit in this archive of shadows, allowing us to keep wandering through forgotten winters and opening doors that were meant to stay closed. It is a small light against a vast night, but sometimes a single flame is enough to show what has been hiding at the edge of our vision. Tonight, that edge lies in the snowbound streets and dim parlors of Victorian England. Tonight we will walk through a world that knew a different Christmas. A Christmas steeped in frost, superstition, and the quiet certainty that the dead were far closer than the church bells suggested. We will trace how the winter solstice and the Christian feast entangled themselves with older fears, turning Christmas Eve into a threshold night when stories became a ritual of survival. And we will begin to understand why, for the Victorians, ghosts felt more honest than carols. Welcome to a winter of shadows. Close the door behind you, let the outside world fall silent, and listen to the floorboards and the wind. They have been waiting a long time for you to arrive. The room is small, the fire is low, and on the table beside the candle is a silver watch ticking away the last fragile moments of the year. To understand why Christmas became a night of hauntings, you must first understand the world that shaped Victorian fears. It was a world where light itself was fragile and easily lost, where the sun vanished early each afternoon and did not return until late the next morning, leaving people to navigate long corridors and narrow streets in a half-darkness that was never entirely trustworthy. It was a world of coal smoke, of chimneys coughing black dust, of lungs that burned and eyes that watered, of nights when the fog was so thick you could taste it. The cold in that world was not romantic, not a pretty glitter on postcards, but something that could kill quietly and without fuss. The poor in their thin, damp rooms could feel winter gnawing at their bones, pressing through thin walls and broken windows, turning breath into icicles and fingers into numb, helpless sticks. Children went to bed shivering and did not always wake. And the bodies of those who failed to survive the season were carried through streets that seemed indifferent to their passing. Disease moved through those frozen neighborhoods like an invisible predator, feeding on weakness, on hunger, on cramped, unventilated rooms where whole families slept head to foot in the same narrow beds. Typhus, cholera, influenza, all of them whispered through the alleys and tenements, and no one knew whose door they would choose to enter next. In such a world, the boundary between life and death did not feel stable. It felt thin, like a curtain that could be pulled aside without warning. And throughout all of this, the calendar crept steadily toward the darkest point of the year. The Victorians lived closer than we do to older rhythms, to the ancient recognition that the winter solstice is the moment when the sun seems to die, when the days have shortened as far as they can. For a few days, the light hangs in suspension, then, almost imperceptibly, begins to grow again. And from that fragile turning point, people once wove myths of death and rebirth, of gods who go down into darkness and return. By the time Christianity had braided itself around those older midwinter beliefs, Christmas arrived not as a clean, singular celebration, but as a layered and sometimes uneasy fusion. On the surface, it was joy and sacred birth. But just beneath lay the older recognition that this was still the season of death, of frozen earth, of long nights crowded with whatever the imagination could not entirely explain. The Victorians inherited this double vision and did not try to resolve it. Instead, they let both truths coexist, like two faces on the same coin. Imagine sitting now in a modest parlor somewhere in the outskirts of the city, in a terraced house where the wallpaper is faded and slightly peeling at the corners. The fire in the grate is small but determined, a cluster of glowing coals that gives off more light than heat. And the air smells of smoke, boiled potatoes, and damp wool drying on chairs by the hearth. Outside the window, muffled by frost, you can hear the distant sounds of church bells tolling the last Sunday of Advent. Around you, the family gathers as the daylight drains away, each person carrying the weight of the year that is ending. The father who has spent his days in a counting house or a factory, the mother whose hands are cracked from soap and cold water, the children whose small faces have watched neighbors taken away in black carriages and have learned, too early, how fragile adults can be. They sit a little closer together than usual, not just for warmth, but for something wordless, a need not to leave anyone alone with their thoughts on this particular night. In that dim room, there is awareness of absence as sharp as any presence. Someone is missing who sat here last year, a chair that is now quietly empty, and the family feels the shape of that absence the way the tongue feels the raw space where a tooth used to be. Christmas in such a room is not only about what is present, but about who is not. The dead are not erased. They are invited in memory, and the line between remembering and summoning grows thinner as the evening deepens. The church might offer hymns and readings and the careful reassurance of doctrine, but once the door is closed and the house belongs only to those inside, a different liturgy begins. Stories are brought out like old, cherished objects, polished and repeated and slightly altered each year. Stories of strange footsteps on staircases long ago, of lights seen where no one was living, of messages passed in dreams that later proved to be terrible and true. These stories do not contradict faith. They sit beside it, occupying the gray spaces that belief leaves unexplained. In a society where death was a familiar visitor, ghosts were less a childish fancy than a language for grief, guilt, and unfinished business. They were the embodiment of regrets that refused to rest, of promises broken, of wrongs unrighted in a world that had no social safety net and little justice for the poor. When a child died of cold or hunger, when a worker was crippled and discarded by an employer who did not even know his name. There were no legal remedies, no compensation, only a lingering sense that something in the world's balance had tilted. And stories of hauntings became a way of imagining that balance restored. The winter night, with its deep silence and its slow, relentless ticking toward another year, gave these unease a stage on which to stand. It is no accident that Christmas Eve, with its combination of sacred expectation and encroaching darkness, became the favored time for such tales. If the birth of hope was to be celebrated at midnight, then the hours leading up to it could be surrendered to everything that hope sought to answer: fear, sorrow, the feeling of being watched by the past. When you sit in that Victorian parlor and listen to the first ghost story of the night, you are not simply seeking cheap thrills. You are consenting to be reminded of mortality in a season that talks loudly of joy, but can never entirely drown out the quieter knowledge that every feast, every gathering is temporary. The fire will burn down, the candles will gutter out, the guests will rise and put on their coats, and someday there will be one Christmas when you are the one who no longer returns. So the tale begins. Perhaps of a man who worked himself to the bone and ignored the suffering around him, only to find his sleep invaded, year after year, by the sound of chains dragging across his floorboards. Or of a house in the countryside where a certain room is kept locked because on one winter night long ago, someone vanished there, leaving only a faint smell of seawater and a scattering of dead leaves on the carpet. The details vary, but the structure is the same. The living fail to see what matters, and the dead come back to demand that they look. In these stories, the ghosts are frightening, but they are rarely meaningless. They do not appear randomly. They are drawn by strong emotions, by injustice, by cruelty, by promises broken in the cold. For the Victorians, to tell a ghost story at Christmas was to acknowledge that the year behind them was full of choices, some of which they regretted, some of which they did not yet have the courage to face, and the ghost took on the role of the conscience that would not stay quiet. Outside, the wind presses against the window pane as if something is leaning against the glass, listening. The street is almost empty now, save for the occasional rattle of a cab and the distant laughter of those whose Christmas is louder, brighter, more careless. Inside, every time the fire cracks, someone glances instinctively toward the darker corners of the room, half expecting to see a figure standing there, just beyond the reach of the light, patient and pale. You sit among them, a traveler out of time, and feel the peculiar intimacy that comes when people share fear in the safety of a close, lamp-lit circle. The story wraps itself around you like smoke, seeping into your clothes, your hair, your thoughts, until the boundary between the world outside and the world inside the tale begins to blur. When the teller falls silent, you become acutely aware of the ticking of the clock, of the slow dripping of wax down the side of the candle, of your own heartbeat. This is the beginning of the Victorian Christmas ghost tradition. Not a spectacle for children, but an adult ritual of confrontation with everything the bright side of the holiday refuses to name. It turns the long, dangerous night into something that can be faced collectively, transforming nameless dread into narrative, into something shaped, spoken, and shared. To sit and listen is to admit that you too are haunted, not by rattling chains perhaps, but by memories, choices, and fears that trail behind you like invisible footsteps in the snow. And as midnight approaches, as the church bells prepare to announce the birth of new hope to the sleeping city, the room grows quieter, not louder. The stories have done their work, stirring up the sediment at the bottom of the mind. And now each listener sits with their own private ghost, thinking of the faces they miss and the mistakes they cannot undo. In that hush, Christmas becomes what it once was for the Victorians, not a denial of darkness, but a fragile candle lit in full awareness of how deep the shadows truly are. In the chapters that follow, we will step deeper into those rooms, into the specific tales and the authors who shaped them, into the social wounds that bled into every haunting. For now, remember this image: a small fire, a ring of grave, attentive faces, the snow pressing against the windows, and a voice saying, quite calmly, "Let me tell you about the time the dead came back on Christmas Eve." That is where our journey into this winter of shadows truly begins. Imagine this. The year is 1865, and snow is falling in thick, deliberate flakes over the rooftops of London. The streets are hushed, muffled by white, and the world seems suspended between one breath and the next, as if the city itself were holding still to listen. In the window of a small bookshop near Fleet Street, gaslight flickers weakly behind frosted glass, illuminating spines of morbid tales printed in cheap ink. Outside, in the silent dark, the smell of burning coal mixes with something sharper, older, the scent of frost and soot and the faint metallic tang of cold air that has traveled a long way. The bells will soon begin to call for midnight mass. But for now, there is only the quiet and the waiting. Everyone knows that Christmas is a time of joy, or at least believes they do. They imagine warmth, laughter, and the steady glow of hearths that banish the darkness outside. But for the Victorians, that same darkness was not to be pushed away. It was to be respected. Midwinter was not a season to forget the dead. It was when the dead were closest. Not long before the coming of electric lights, England belonged to shadows and superstition. The Victorians were caught between two worlds, the rising age of reason and the lingering breath of something older, murkier, half pagan and half Christian. They built railways and telegraphs, yes, but they also believed in omens, in haunted houses, in the possibility that a knock on the door after midnight was not always from the living. When December arrived, it brought with it a peculiar melancholy, a collective hush that crept even into the decadent drawing rooms of the wealthy. The fog grew thicker, the streets darker, and the long hours of night began to feel endless. In that endlessness, people found the perfect backdrop for the strange and the unseen. They lit fires, drew close, and told themselves stories that clawed at the mind like unseen fingers in the dark. To the modern listener, it may seem paradoxical. Ghosts at Christmas, death in the season of joy. But this juxtaposition was exactly what gave it power. The Victorians understood something we have forgotten, that life and death are not opposites, but threads wound around the same spindle. At the very moment they celebrated birth and renewal, they could not help but feel the pull of decay, of absence, of memory turned spectral. The church calendar itself hinted at this ancient rhythm. Christmas stood atop the ashes of older solstice festivals, from Saturnalia's revels to the Norse Yule, celebrations that recognized the longest night as both a danger and a promise. In the darkness, people danced and drank and told stories, not to escape death, but to keep it company until the light returned. The Victorians, heirs to all those layered rituals, simply gave the tales form. Ghosts that returned home for Christmas the way families did. The thinness of the veil between the living and the dead became a constant theme in winter folklore. Somewhere between superstition and faith lay the idea that Christmas Eve was a threshold night, when the boundaries trembled and the world allowed its hidden inhabitants to cross over. Old women told children to leave a candle burning on the windowsill, so wandering souls might find their way back home. Men coming home from taverns claimed they heard footsteps that matched their own, but never saw who followed. In the countryside, the belief was even older, more primal. Farmers whispered that on Christmas Eve, animals spoke in the midnight hours, remembering the stable of Bethlehem. Churchyards were said to open briefly, letting spirits walk among their gravestones once more. In some parishes, the bells were not rung just for Mass, but as a warning, to remind any lingering dead that they must return to their rest before dawn. So, when families settled by the hearth and traded ghost stories, they were not simply entertaining themselves with fright. They were participating in an inherited ritual, both sacred and profane, acknowledging that fear is as much a part of humanity as hope. The flickering firelight, the ticking of the clock, the hush of snow outside. These were the boundaries of a small world made safe precisely because it contained danger. To tell a Christmas ghost story was to confess belief in the unseen order of the world. It was to agree that wrongs demanded reckoning, that love could reach beyond the grave, that those who were forgotten might still seek remembrance. Every tale of a knocking ghost or a midnight vision carried, beneath the chill, a moral heartbeat. And this was the paradox the Victorians cherished. Terror that taught virtue, horror that led to redemption. Consider the timing. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England's landscape, covering its soil with smoke and its people with relentless labor. Death was no longer confined to distant battlefields or the rural poor. It lived in the factories, in the smog-choked cities, in tenements where whole families perished from hunger or disease. In such a society, ghosts were not abstract. They were the faces of real people left behind by progress. It is no wonder that the supernatural found fertile ground in this new, lonely world. The middle class, rising in wealth but losing its faith in simple certainties, turned to spiritualism and seance tables to bridge the widening gulf between material success and emotional emptiness. The parlor became both sanctuary and stage, where the candle's flame flickered between the natural and the supernatural. And so Christmas, already heavy with ritual, became the perfect vessel for these anxieties. The season of gathering drew every ghost to the hearth, both metaphorical and real. For one night, the moral and physical cold of the world could be transformed into story, a reminder that the unseen was all around, and that every comfort borrowed from the present came at a cost paid in memory. The Victorians were not naive. They lived surrounded by death. Mortality hovered everywhere, on the streets where disease and poverty thrived, in wars that stole sons and fathers, in childbirths that claimed mothers, and in the endless rows of black crepe adorning doors. But if they could not defeat death, they could make meaning of it, shaping the terror into narrative form. To give the dead a voice was to give the living solace. Ghost stories became, therefore, a kind of cultural exorcism, a civil negotiation with grief. Beneath the trembling candlelight, listeners learned the rules of their own fears. Behind every haunting, there was a lesson: the miser who refused compassion, the lover who betrayed, the skeptic who mocked faith only to find himself pursued by evidence of eternity. Every ghost asked a question that society could not otherwise face. What, in a nation so obsessed with progress, had been left behind? What made Christmas the most appropriate backdrop was its duality, celebration and mourning intertwined. The birth of light took place at the heart of winter's coldest darkness. The Victorians saw no contradiction there. They knew that renewal requires decay, that the year must die before it can begin again. To speak of ghosts on Christmas Eve was to echo that eternal cycle, the belief that something always returns. Picture again the parlor. The family gathered, the youngest sitting cross-legged before the fire, their eyes wide and luminous as the shadows dance across their faces. The storyteller's voice is low, rhythmic, a tide rising and retreating, drawing them deeper into a landscape where reason falters. Outside, the snow thickens, the house creaks softly, and everyone hears it, the whisper of air in the chimney that sounds almost like breathing. The ghost story is not a diversion, it is communion. It replaces the sterile comfort of sermons with something older, rawer, true. It allows those trapped by propriety and grief to weep indirectly through the lives of imaginary specters. The story becomes both elegy and exorcism, allowing the listeners to acknowledge what they have lost and yet feel somehow cleansed. The language of those tales was steeped in the imagery of penitence and fear. Words like frost, shroud, silence, and redemption recur as if engraved on the tongue of an age that loved to moralize as much as it loved to tremble. The ghost never appears without purpose. Even its chill breath carries instruction. Perhaps the lesson is compassion, perhaps humility, perhaps simply remembrance. Through such narratives, the Victorians found a peculiar comfort. They recognized their own cracks reflected in those of the haunted and the haunter alike. The ghost was not the other. It was the echo of one's own conscience. In the rattle of chains or the quiet lament of an unseen presence, they heard their buried guilt given form. For a world obsessed with propriety, ghosts spoke forbidden truths. They uncovered what polite society preferred to ignore. And yet, amidst these terror tales, there ran an undercurrent of tenderness. The supernatural meeting was often not about vengeance, but forgiveness. Lovers long parted by misfortune found reunion beyond the veil. Parents lost to fever returned to watch over their children. The Victorians did not fear such hauntings entirely. They envied them too, longing for the thin chance that the heart could remain connected even after the flesh had perished. Every December, magazines and newspapers printed new ghost stories alongside recipes and sermons. Writers were encouraged to contribute eerie pieces specifically for Christmas editions, playing to the public demand for chills to balance the sugar of the season. It became a tradition as expected as pudding or carols. The annual haunting, a reminder that the festive fire warmed only because the winter outside was vast and cold. When readers opened those pages by lamplight, they did not see contradiction. They saw honesty. They saw in those stories the acknowledgement that joy and suffering cannot be separated, that the world is never purely light or dark. Each Christmas ghost story was a candle and a shadow at once, a confession that even in our brightest hours, something unquiet keeps us company. Faith itself did not vanish in these tales. it transformed. God might still be listening, but now, so were the forgotten, the wronged, the restless. The Victorians called them ghosts, but sometimes they were simply the embodiment of memory refusing erasure. The season of light thus depended on the recognition of darkness, for only those who have stood in the longest night understand the value of the dawn. And when morning finally came, when bells rang out across snow-covered streets and sunlight glinted weakly off frost-coated windowsills, it did not erase the darkness of the night before. It redefined it. The memory of those whispered stories lingered like smoke, a faint trace reminding everyone that light is fragile and must be tended carefully, that the shadows are never fully gone. They retreat just far enough to remind us what we owe to them. That was the night of spirits, not merely superstition, but a collective act of reconciliation with the unseen. It was an unspoken admission that the human heart is haunted by its past, by its losses, by its own conscience. The ghosts of Victorian Christmases were messengers, not monsters, lit by the same candle that burned atop each mantle in hope that someone, or something, might yet find its way home. As we move deeper into this story, we will step closer to the men and women who gave form to those hauntings. Writers, preachers, and dreamers who turned dread into art. But for now, remember this. Behind every Christmas carol once lingered the echo of a ghost's sigh. And behind every flickering flame, a shadow that refused to die. The Victorians did not choose between the two. They held both in their trembling hands, and in doing so, they made Christmas eternal. Picture this. The clock on the mantel has just struck 9, and in a modest Victorian parlor, the flames in the grate burn low and red, painting the walls with restless shadows. Outside, the wind scrapes along the street like a dull knife, rattling loose shutters and worrying at the edges of every window frame. You are seated in a high-backed chair whose fabric smells faintly of dust and coal smoke. Your hands wrapped around a cup of something warm that has long since cooled. Around you, the room gathers itself into an intimate circle. A worn sofa, 2 straight chairs, a small table bearing the weight of a single candle, and the quiet figures of those who share this night with you. The rest of the house lies in darkness, as if the world has shrunk to nothing but this one flickering room. This is the stage upon which the Victorian Christmas ghost story truly lived. Not in public squares or grand cathedrals, but in cramped parlors and drawing rooms, where the wallpaper curled slightly at the seams. Families of modest means and families of wealth alike shared this ritual, though the furnishings differed. The constant element was the fire, the only living light that stood between human faces and the encroaching darkness. The meal has been eaten. The dishes have been stacked in a corner, waiting for morning. Bellies are warm, but minds are restless, unwilling to surrender so quickly to sleep while the night still presses its weight against the windows. Someone, an uncle with a flair for drama, a grandmother with a memory full of old tales, suggests the inevitable as casually as if inviting a hymn. Shall we have a story? In that simple question lies a ritual older than the gas lamps outside. The family draws closer, not only to hear better, but to lean into one another's warmth, forming a tight ring around the hearth as if the fire were an altar. Children who have been dozing stir and sit up straighter, eyes bright with that particular blend of anticipation and dread only a good ghost story can summon. The storyteller chooses their seat carefully, often opposite the fire so that the flames illuminate the face from below, sculpting the features into something a little less familiar. This is important, because for the length of the tale, they will not simply be themselves. they will be a medium, a channel through which the dead and the absent can briefly speak. Their voice will have to carry that weight. Notice how the room changes as the first words are spoken. Conversation falls away like a dropped curtain, replaced by a silence that is not emptiness, but attention. A silence thick with breath, with the tiny crackle of embers, with the faint ticking of that ever-present clock. Even the wind outside begins to sound like part of the story, a distant accompaniment in an unseen key. The tale does not begin with blood or screams. It begins gently, in the language of ordinary life, placing you in a carriage on a lonely road, or at a lodging house where something feels slightly wrong, or in a deserted churchyard on a night much like this one. The Victorian storyteller understands that horror works best when it slips gradually through the seams of normality like cold air. You are addressed not as a distant observer, but as a participant. Imagine, they say, that you have been invited to stay in a country house where certain rooms are seldom used. Imagine that you are walking home after dark and the fog begins to thicken around your ankles. Imagine that you wake in the night and feel the weight of eyes upon you from the corner of the room where no one stands. By the time the real haunting begins, you are already inside the story, and the story is inside you. Around the fire, each listener reacts in their own way. The brave sit rigid and still, their faces composed, but their fingers clenched tight around the arms of their chairs. The more sensitive draw shawls or blankets closer, as if cloth could keep out what the imagination lets in. Even those who insist they do not believe in such nonsense find themselves glancing occasionally at the door, half expecting it to open without a hand upon the latch. This shared vulnerability is part of the ritual's power. In everyday life, Victorian society demanded restraint, composure, and a certain hardness in the face of constant suffering. Men were expected to be rational and controlled, women pious and calm, children obedient and silent. But within the circle of the ghost story, cracks were allowed to show. Fear was no longer shameful. It was the price of admission. The tale deepens. The house in the story reveals a locked room or a portrait whose eyes seem to follow the viewer, or a staircase where one hears footsteps but never sees the walker. The storyteller lingers on sensory details: the smell of damp stone, the feel of a cold banister under the hand, the sound of something that may be wind but might be whispering. In describing these things, they are painting with darkness. When the specter in the tale appears, dragging chains or whispering a name, each listener fills that spectral face with their own private loss. The ghost becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever the heart has refused to confront directly. The fear is real, but so is the comfort of knowing that everyone else in the room is feeling it too, that no one's grief is entirely solitary. The ghost stories that thrived in this environment were rarely senseless. They came with a structure that echoed confession and judgment. A wrong had been done in the past, a betrayal, an act of cruelty, a cowardice that cost another person their future. The living character in the story either ignored this wrong or benefited from it, and the ghost arrives to demand recognition, to insist that the moral ledger be balanced. This appealed profoundly to Victorian listeners, who lived in a world where justice often failed them. Employers went unpunished for fatal neglect, landlords profited from misery, and the poor died anonymous deaths in workhouses. In the safe fiction of the parlor, at least, the dead could rise and force the living to look at what they had done, and sometimes to change. But the gatherings were not always solemn and grim. There were nervous jokes, exaggerated shudders, Laughter released like steam when a particularly chilling passage finally ended. Fear in this context was controlled, fenced in by the boundaries of the room and the knowledge that, in the end, one could always stand up, stir the fire, and refill a cup of tea. The terrors of the story were terrifying because they ended. Real life offered no such neat conclusion. It is also important to understand that these fireside rituals crossed class lines in different ways. In upper middle-class homes, ghost stories might be read aloud from the latest periodical, the author's name known and debated, the language polished and literary. In poorer households, the tales were more likely to be oral, inherited, and rough-edged, stitched together from local legends and half-remembered reports of strange events. Yet the emotional architecture remained the same. Both rich and poor alike sat in circles of warmth, surrounded by seas of cold. Both navigated the tension between faith and fear. Both used narrative to negotiate with forces beyond their control. The ghost by the fire was a democratic figure. It haunted anyone who was willing to listen long enough. Imagine now that you are the one asked to tell the story. All eyes turn to you. The room waits. You feel the weight of expectation, the responsibility to carry your listeners safely into the dark and back again. Your own fears stir beneath your ribs as you reach into your memory, not only for plots you have heard, but for personal experiences you have never fully explained to yourself. Perhaps you choose to tell them about the night you woke as a child and saw a figure at the foot of your bed that vanished when you blinked. Perhaps you recount the time you walked past a house you later learned had been empty for years, though you could swear you saw someone move behind the curtains. In this moment, your life and fiction bleed into one another, and the room leans forward, hungry for the contact. As you speak, you feel an odd camaraderie with all those anonymous storytellers across the country, in other houses, with other fires. On this same night, somewhere in the north, a miner's family is listening to a tale about a dead foreman who still walks the pit tunnels at Christmas, checking lamps. Somewhere by the sea, a widow tells her children about a drowned sailor who comes home only on the eve of the holy day to stand outside and look up at the window. The tradition is not written down in any holy book, yet it carries the weight of ritual all the same. It establishes a pattern, a rhythm: feast, warmth, story, silence, and then the solemn walk to bed. Between the last word of the tale and the final snuffing of the candle, there is a suspended moment when everyone wonders, privately, whether something from the story might choose to linger. That question is what keeps the tradition alive. For the Victorians, gathered by the fire was not simply a physical description, but a spiritual posture. It meant turning away from the harsh glare of public life, from factories and offices and crowded streets, and turning inward instead, to the home, the family, the self, and the unseen presences that haunt all three. The ghost story was the key that unlocked that inward door, if only for an hour. As the night stretches on, some of the younger children are sent to bed, protesting but secretly relieved. The older ones remain, initiated into the deeper strata of the ritual. The stories become more complex, more psychological, less about visible phantoms and more about impressions, dreams, and paralyzing intuitions that something is terribly wrong in an otherwise ordinary setting. You can feel the fatigue of the year in the air, the sighs of adults who have worked too hard for too little, the ache of bodies worn down by cold and effort. Yet they stay awake for this, for the chance to be unsettled in a controlled way, to feel something intense that is not simply hunger or exhaustion. The ghost story becomes both escape and confrontation, a paradox that the Victorian mind seemed especially drawn to. Eventually, the final story is told, often one with a quieter ending, not a scream, but a whisper. A ghost that does not terrify, but simply looks in at a window and then turns away. A presence that visits only once and leaves behind not horror, but a strange peace. It is as if the ritual itself recognizes that the heart cannot sustain pure dread. It must be allowed a softer landing. The fire has burned low, collapsed into a bed of glowing coals that pulse like a slow heartbeat. One by one, those gathered rise, stretch stiff limbs, and extinguish the remaining lights. As you make your way upstairs along a cold corridor, the boards creak under your feet, and for a moment you think you hear another step behind you, in perfect rhythm with your own. You pause, turn, and see nothing but darkness. Yet the stories have done their work. You slip into bed with the peculiar sense that the house is more crowded than it appears, that memories and presences you cannot quite define are standing guard at every door. Sleep, when it comes, is filled with images that may be dreams or may be something else. And when morning brings the clamor of carols and clinking dishes, the night before lingers like a shadow at the edge of the light. Gathered by the fire, the Victorians created a private theater in which they could rehearse their deepest anxieties about death, guilt, and the thinness of the world's moral ice. They used story as both shield and sword, cutting into their own fears while sheltering within the circle of shared experience. In the glow of those flames, Christmas became not merely a festival of joy, but a carefully staged negotiation with the dark. In the next turn of our journey, we will sit beside one particular storyteller whose ghostly Christmas tale shaped how generations would imagine the season. But never forget the nameless voices who came before and after him, in countless rooms like this one, teaching their children and themselves to listen to the silence between the crackling logs. For it is in that silence, more than in any written text, that the true spirit of the Victorian Christmas haunting still resides. Picture this: London, 1843. The streets are slick with frost and filth, and the city stinks of coal smoke, cheap gin, and despair. Beneath the gaslights, a thin fog clings to the alleyways like a second skin, blurring the difference between the living and the dead. You are walking past shuttered shops, their windows frosted over with delicate webs of ice. From deeper in the lane comes the sound of coughing, followed by a weak laugh and the clink of a beggar's tin cup. Christmas is approaching, but few would recognize it as the bright spectacle it later became. It is, for most, another night to endure rather than celebrate. Somewhere nearby, within a cramped room lit by dying coals, a writer sits hunched over a desk, his pen scratching furiously against cheap paper. His name is Charles Dickens. His lamp sputters as he works, the air thick with smoke and exhaustion. He writes not merely to tell a story, but to exorcise something: the coldness of a city that has learned to look away from its own suffering. We know the tale he penned that winter: a miser, 3 ghosts, redemption. But the story we think we know has been stripped of its blood and darkness. It has been dressed in glitter and cheer until its skeletal heart has been forgotten. Dickens did not set out to write comfort. He set out to haunt. Imagine for a moment what England was when he wrote it. The industrial age was in full command, its engines devouring coal and human lives alike. Children crawled through chimneys and slept in workhouses colder than the grave. The poor sold their time, their health, and sometimes their bodies for a crust of bread. Charity had become performance, guilt disguised as moral superiority. In that world, the idea of Christmas meant little more than a single day's reprieve for those who could afford it. For everyone else, it was another turn of the wheel under the same indifferent sky. Yet Dickens, like the old storytellers by the hearth, understood that horror could wake the sleepers better than sermons ever could. So he wrote a ghost story. He called it A Christmas Carol, but its structure followed the ancient patterns of haunting. A man cut off from love, surrounded by the dead, confronted by spirits who force him to look upon what he refuses to see. It is not a parable of generosity so much as a Gothic visitation, a night journey through the frozen corridors of one man's soul. Ebenezer Scrooge is not meant to begin in the light. He begins in shadow. He is cold because his world is cold, because every system around him rewards indifference and punishes compassion. When the first ghost comes to him, the spirit of his former partner, it is not merely a phantom bearing warning, but the embodiment of consequence. The chains Marley drags through Scrooge's room are the same chains the city itself has forged through exploitation and greed. The horror of Marley's visit lies not only in the spectacle, but in the revelation. This ghost is not other, it is himself. Dickens does not give him a monster to vanquish. He gives him a mirror. For the Victorians who read it, this was more terrifying than any specter rising from a graveyard, because it implied that the ghost world was born from moral failure, not divine punishment. When Scrooge meets the ghost of Christmas past, he sees the warmth he once had, the tenderness once possible before ambition devoured it. This stage of the haunting is not frightening in the traditional sense. It burns rather than chills. Dickens uses nostalgia as a blade, forcing Scrooge and those like him to acknowledge not what they have endured, but what they have destroyed. The second visitation, the ghost of Christmas Present, is the opposite of most ghostly apparitions. It is vivid, alive, radiant with color and abundance. Yet this spirit carries its own dread, reminding Scrooge that others feast while whole families starve. The two children beneath its robe, ignorance and want, are Dickens's truest phantoms, monsters born from neglect, their hunger gnawing at the edges of society. The scene is not fantasy, but testimony. By the time the final spirit arrives, cloaked and silent, Scrooge's redemption has not yet come. It must be wrestled from terror. The ghost of Christmas yet to come is the most traditional haunting of them all, with its skeletal hand and voiceless gaze, the embodiment of judgment deferred. It shows him the end all men fear, to be forgotten, unmourned, unnoticed. A death of spirit long before the death of flesh. Through this chain of visitations, Dickens achieves something remarkable. He fuses the moral didacticism of Christian tradition with the visceral fear of Gothic storytelling, crafting a myth that feels both sacred and haunted. Christmas becomes not the denial of despair, but an opportunity to confront it, to meet the ghosts of one's actions and atone before the final reckoning. It is easy now to see A Christmas Carol as sentimental, but that sentimentality is a veneer left by time. The Victorians first read it as a shock, a mirror that showed the ghostly machinery of their own city. And they recognized, perhaps uneasily, that Scrooge was not a fairy tale villain, but an avatar of themselves. The story's power lay in its recognition that haunting was not supernatural punishment, but spiritual arithmetic. The success of Dickens's tale spread quickly. Within weeks, families who could not afford fine gifts bought cheap reprints or hired readers to perform it aloud by the fire. The story returned the ghost to Christmas not as an intruder, but as its oldest guest. And though later generations simplified it into a moral lesson about generosity, those who lived closest to its creation saw it for what it was: an exorcism. Dickens's genius was not simply in making people feel pity for the poor. It was in making them feel fear for their own souls. The ghosts of the carol are not there to frighten for amusement. They are dramatized conscience, the invisible weight of choices deferred and lives ignored. Each one drags through the text like a moral chain waiting for the reader's wrist. Consider the parallels between Scrooge's haunted night and the collective Victorian psyche. Both begin in denial, insisting that suffering is distant or deserved. Both are visited by reminders of memory, consequence, and mortality. Both face a vision of extinction and awaken trembling, eager to undo the past, but frightened by how much of it cannot be undone. The haunting, in each case, is the process of becoming human again. For Victorians gathered by the fire, to hear, A Christmas Carol was to relive their own complicity and hope simultaneously. It was a revelation disguised as entertainment, a sermon wrapped in fog and nightmare. The ghost story's power lay in its way of slipping past defenses, of turning morality into something visceral, something seen in the dark rather than heard in daylight sermons. Dickens was not alone in this fusion of ghostly dread and moral redemption, but he perfected it. His ghosts do not terrify for terror's sake. They demand change. Even the famous closing transformation, often read as sentimental, is soaked in existential fear. Scrooge does not wake to joy. He wakes to relief, to the realization that the door to damnation has not yet closed completely. In this sense, Dickens redeemed fear itself. He transformed the ghost story from mere Gothic diversion into a tool of ethical reckoning. He offered his readers an experience that allowed them to face horror without being destroyed by it, to confront the graves they had dug collectively through indifference. The supernatural became the means through which conscience could speak when polite society refused to listen. It is worth remembering that Dickens himself knew hunger, knew humiliation, knew what it was to be among the forgotten. As a child forced to work in a blacking factory while his father languished in debtor's prison, he saw how invisible suffering could be made. The ghosts of his fiction are the same ghosts that visited his own youth. The spirits of neglect, hunger, and shame, silent but unrelenting. Thus, his Christmas story became an act of moral engineering, meant to haunt readers into compassion. He did not ask them to believe in spirits in order to fear God, but to believe in spirits in order to remember humanity. In this, the ghosts become benevolent not by being kind, but by being truthful. They tear down the illusions that protect the comfortable from guilt. The transformation of Scrooge at dawn is symbolic of more than personal salvation. It represents the larger Victorian yearning for moral rebirth. The city itself needs what he experiences, the courage to wake and act before time freezes over completely. Dickens's vision turned London into its own haunted house, full of unseen connections and restless souls who demanded to be recognized as brothers and sisters rather than phantoms. Picture this. It is the final years of the 19th century, and the streets of London blaze with a new kind of light. Electric bulbs hum beneath glass globes, scattering the night that once belonged to fog and flame. The shadows that used to stretch like living things across the cobblestones are retreating, driven away not by dawn, but by invention. The world has changed almost overnight. The same city that once flickered with candlelight from 10,000 windows now gleams with mechanical precision, every corner banished of mystery. Factories roar through the evening. Department stores stay open past sunset. Light, that precious companion of warmth and secrecy, has become a commodity measured in watts and profit. It is here, beneath this triumph of illumination, that the ghosts begin to fade. The old stories, the candlelit hauntings, the whispers at midnight, the pale figures glimpsed in the fog, no longer find welcome. Modernity prides itself on progress, and progress accepts no phantoms. The Victorians had given birth to the industrial age, and now the child had outgrown its fear of the dark. Yet somewhere within this new brilliance lies a quiet loss. For centuries, the long nights of winter offered human beings something rare: stillness. In that hush between cold and dawn, when lamps guttered low and breath steamed into the air, the mind became receptive to silence and story. Now, the silence is filled with the growl of engines and the ringing of cash registers. The darkness has been replaced, not healed, only forgotten. You can see it in the architecture itself. The old stone cottages and damp parlors where ghost stories once lived are being torn down to make room for wide glass shop fronts. The fireplace, that sacred heart of the Christmas gathering, gives way to radiators and metal stoves. Families no longer sit together in circles, but dine under chandeliers in public restaurants. The hearth, which once bound them to their ancestors, is gone. With its disappearance, the ritual of the fireside haunting begins to wane. Newspapers still print ghost tales, but they are treated as novelty rather than necessity. The Christmas edition of a magazine might include a story or two to amuse those too full of pudding to sleep. But the reverence is gone. The ghost has become a guest too impolite for the new century's rational mind. This transformation is not accidental. It mirrors the new religion of industry. The Victorians, for all their fascination with ghosts, gave birth to the very forces that would exile them. Advances, factories produce, wealth accumulates, and with each machine switched on, another candle is extinguished. Electricity does what no sermon could. It teaches people to stop fearing the dark by denying its existence. But progress has its own ghosts. The early 20th century, brightly lit and confident, walks upon the bones of something older. The spiritual hunger that once found solace in stories of the supernatural now turns to psychology, to seances, to the faint hope that meaning might still flicker beneath the surface of material life. The dead do not stop speaking, they merely change their language. Imagine standing outside one of those new department stores on Christmas Eve around the year 1900. Rows of dazzling bulbs frame every window, displaying toys, perfumes, gold watches. A mechanical Santa nods endlessly beneath the glow, his painted face too bright, his smile too wide. Crowds move past, entranced not by wonder, but by hunger. No one is telling stories tonight. They are buying them. What light grants in clarity, it steals in intimacy. The old gatherings depended on shadows, on faces half illumined by flame, on the gentle rhythm of a voice that rose and fell with the fire's breath. In artificial brilliance, there is no space for imagination to bloom. The mind needs darkness to dream, and the heart needs uncertainty to feel awe. The eternal flame of the story is harder to see beneath the glare. Slowly, the Christmas ghost becomes a curiosity, a quaint reminder of less enlightened times. School children learn of Dickens not as a prophet of conscience, but as a moralist for holiday festivity. The supernatural elements of his work are smoothed away in retellings, simplified, made harmless. The terrifying eyes of Marley become glittering special effects. The lesson remains, but the chill has been drained. The magazines that once thrived on Gothic atmosphere shift to celebrating luxury, fashion, and imperial pride. Advertisements boast not of mysteries, but of progress. Electric kettles, phonographs, and the promise of instant comfort. The cultural appetite for fear, tightly leashed but sincere, is replaced by appetite itself. Consumption becomes its own ritual, desire its only ghost. By the 1920s, the art of the Christmas haunting is nearly gone from polite homes. Radio will soon dominate the domestic soundscape, replacing the human voice with broadcast perfection. The story told face-to-face becomes less common, replaced by performances spoken into microphones. The shared hush of the listening circle, that precious silence broken only by the crackle of a log, is drowned in static. Yet something in the human psyche resists full extinction. For even as technology banishes the literal darkness, emotional shadows persist. War follows war, loneliness deepens amidst crowded cities, and the lights that burn through the night begin to feel less like victory and more like insomnia. The ghosts, banished by progress, begin to return in subtler forms: anxiety, nostalgia, memory. Writers of the early 20th century, inheritors of the Victorian imagination, adapt the ghost to this new environment. The hauntings move from crumbling mansions and graveyards into the inner chambers of the mind. The Christmas ghost may fade, but the ghost story evolves. Quieter, psychological, more tragic than frightening. The new phantoms are guilt and longing stitched into time's fabric. Yet for all this evolution, one truth remains. Something essential was lost when the candlelight died. The old Christmas Eve, its dim corridors, its whispering fires, its sense of unseen listeners beyond the human circle, had been a covenant with mystery. It reminded those gathered that their world was fragile and extraordinary, balanced on the threshold between light and void. That awareness, once woven through the holiday, gave Christmas its soul. Think again of that final Victorian generation, the ones who still remember the smell of tallow candles, the warmth of coal fires, the thrill of hearing a ghost story told aloud. They watched their grandchildren grow up unafraid of the dark, but haunted by other specters. The endless need for novelty, the fear of irrelevance in a mechanical world. The ghosts may have retreated from parlors, but they now linger in the human heart. You can sense them in the way people crowd the streets under electric garlands, seeking not joy, but distraction. You can hear them in the carols played too loudly in shops where no one listens. The rituals remain, but they are hollow copies of what once bound communities together in shared contemplation of mortality and mercy. The candlelight has been replaced by neon, its delicate tremble by unwavering glare. And so the question arises, when did Christmas become about forgetting rather than remembering? Once, it was the season of reckoning, of counting the souls absent at the table and honoring their invisible presence. Now, it is the season of avoidance, of filling silence with music so the ghosts cannot speak. Modernity gave light to every corner, but in doing so, it erased the shapes that taught us humility. Imagine just for a moment the sound of that lost night. The crackle of pine logs, the slow ticking of a mantel clock, the muffled chime of bells across snow, the soft, deliberate tone of a storyteller saying, "Once, on a night like this, there lived a man who heard footsteps in the snow." Such a moment no longer exists, yet its echo continues to reverberate through culture, faint but persistent. And perhaps this too is a kind of haunting. The death of the candlelight is not the death of imagination, but its exile. We cannot destroy what we have already invited in. We can only deny its name. The ghosts hidden in the electric centuries are no longer seen, but they remain, quiet, patient, waiting for the power to fail, for the light to flicker once more. In the 20th century, the Christmas ghost lives on in fragments. It hides in literature, in whispered family legends, in the sense of melancholy that settles over even the brightest festivities. It is there when the party ends, when the last drink is poured, when a solitary figure stands at a window watching snow fall on an otherwise empty street. The ghost does not knock anymore. It looks out through us. The spirit of Dickens, and of those anonymous storytellers before him, remains intertwined with the winter night. They understood that we require shadows to see depth, that meaning begins where certainty ends. The electric light flattens that depth, offering visibility without vision. It blinds gently, persuading us that there is nothing beyond the reach of our inventions. But there always is. When the old fires went out, and the new ones hummed in their place, humanity claimed victory over, and surrendered something soul-deep in exchange. The candle, flickering and mortal, once mirrored our own vulnerability, reminding us that all flames fade. The bulb, steady and constant, turns night into day, but severs that intimacy with transience. The light may be eternal, but its warmth is artificial. And so, the death of the candlelight symbolizes the deeper death of stillness. The Victorian evening gave us space to think, to fear, to remember. Its successors give us no such luxury. Continuous brightness banishes contemplation as effectively as it banished shadow. Without darkness, reflection dies. Without reflection, ghosts lose their home. In a world that never sleeps, haunting becomes metaphor. The ghosts of today are not wrapped in sheets or lingering by graveyards. They are the thoughts that wake us at 3 a.m, the hollow ache that festive lights cannot fill. We have traded the supernatural for the psychological, but both speak the same truth. We are creatures who cannot entirely escape our past. So tonight, if you find yourself beneath a row of modern lights, remember the candle. Remember the way its flame once danced, offering both comfort and warning. Remember that every brightness is born of darkness, and that forgetting this balance is the most dangerous superstition of all. For when we forget our ghosts, they do not vanish. They simply change their form and start to haunt us from within. Picture this: England, somewhere in the far north. The year is 1913. The snow comes early and stays long, clinging to church roofs and hedgerows, while the wind carries a deep, organ-like note through the empty fields. In a farmhouse at the edge of the moor, a family gathers for Christmas Eve while the fire burns low, its embers glowing like watchful eyes. The room is modest but warm. The grandfather clock ticks solemnly in the corner. A child stirs on a rug by the hearth. The scent of pine and roasted chestnuts fills the air. It is nearly midnight, and the house feels at once crowded and lonesome. For everyone knows that this is the night when the living draw near to the dead, and the dead answer softly back. Before long, someone begins to speak. The voice belongs to an elder, cracked but steady, carrying the weight of many winters. The story is not written anywhere. It has no author, no credited source, only the authority of centuries. It begins as so many Christmas tales do, with solitude. In a nearby village, the old man says, there once lived a bell ringer named Thomas Gray, who served the church faithfully his entire life. On Christmastide, he would climb the frozen steps of the bell tower to sound the midnight peal that welcomed the birth of hope anew. But one year, they found him collapsed beside the ropes, hands blackened by frost, his mouth twisted as though he'd seen something unspeakable before he fell. Since that night, villagers claim that at the stroke of 12 on Christmas Eve, the bells rang themselves. No one dared climb the tower, for those who tried said they felt a hand on their shoulder where no one stood. As the story ends, the fire crackles. The listeners shift uneasily. The elder says no more. The room remains still, as though the story itself waits to see if the bells will toll. This is how ghost stories once breathed. Passed not through printing presses, but through lips, shaped by voices trembling or amused, grounded in the landscape that birthed them. They mingled sorrow with wonder, fear with faith, creating living folklore from the marrow of ordinary nights. And though progress has scattered the communities that nurtured them, their echoes remain, traveling in silence from generation to generation, like faint signals through snow. Another voice joins in, this one younger, eager, almost reverent. The storyteller recalls a second tale, one told by her mother, about a traveler delayed by storm who found refuge in a grand but lonely inn. The innkeeper, smiling too warmly, offered him supper beside a roaring fire. But every portrait in the room seemed to watch with mournful eyes. Later, when dawn came and he went to thank his host, the building stood in ruins, long abandoned. Yet on the hearth, the ashes still smoked. No lesson is explained aloud. The silence afterward carries its own meaning. The family sits listening to the winter settle around the walls, each person imagining that somewhere out there, the snow is erasing not only footprints, but time itself. The stories are less about fear now than about continuity. Proof that the past has not fully vanished, that memory still speaks through chill wind and echoing corridors. In the dying decades of empire, when machines had conquered the dark and cities had swallowed the countryside, the ghost story served a new purpose. It reminded listeners that even progress walks in footsteps left by those who came before. The haunted house is not just a building, it is civilization itself, layered with lives and losses, lit briefly by each generation, before fading again into shadow. The teller turns next to a final story, the kind that lingers. It concerns a widow named Alice Wren, who lived near the cliffs of Whitby with her son. Her husband had drowned one winter in a fishing accident. Since then, she placed a single lantern in her window each Christmas Eve, saying it would guide the lost home to rest. One year, her son went to sea to collect driftwood, and when he did not return, the light stayed burning for 3 nights instead of 1. On the 4th dawn, villagers saw 2 silhouettes in her window. The widow, and beside her, the shape of a man drenched in salt. After this tale, the youngest in the room stares into the heart of the fire, seeing forms there that flicker just beyond recognition. It is not fear that fills her, but recognition, as though the flames were mirrors showing the living their own eventual reflection. The ghosts in these stories are not monsters. They are loved ones, regrets, memories given shape to remind us that remembering is a sacred act. Outside, the snow thickens, deadening every sound beyond the window. The family sits closer now, aware that what they share in this room belongs to a vanishing world. In a few years, engines will roar across these fields. War will swallow many suns. The ritual will scatter, and the stories will retreat underground, surviving only where the night remains quiet enough to listen. Yet for this moment, they hold on to something ancient. A lineage of voices stretching back through centuries of storytellers who sat beside different fires, in cottages and manors alike, facing the same profound truth, that humans are bridges between the seen and unseen. Every ghost story is a confession of that inborn duality, an affirmation that life continues in memory, if nowhere else. As the fire dips lower, someone hums a carol, soft and minor. The tune speaks of peace on earth, but in the dim room, it sounds like a lament, a hymn for the forgotten. The carol and the ghost tale belong to the same instinct, the yearning to make sense of darkness, to find continuity amid decay. They are two halves of a single tradition, separated only by tone. Think of how strange it is, then, that modern culture chose to keep the carol and discard the haunting. The feast remained, but the moral vanished. The joy stayed, but its shadow was denied. Christmas without fear is like winter without night. It glows too brightly to feel real. The Victorians, for all their superstition, at least understood that light must earn its right to shine. Perhaps that is why the ghost story endures in whispers even now. It hides in cinema, in music, in the melancholy that creeps into the quiet hours of December. It manifests when someone mentions a dream of a lost friend, or when a scent drifts from nowhere and reminds us of a home long gone. These are our modern hauntings, subtle yet universal. We live among them like fish, unaware of the water that contains them. There is, in this recognition, a comfort. Ghost stories, at their core, are not about fear of death, but profound resistance to forgetting. They insist that everything leaves a trace, that the past is not abolished, but transformed. The hearth, with its ephemeral flame, becomes the perfect symbol, a space where warmth and extinction coexist, where we can look into the fire and see both life and its inevitable end. By the final hour, the house grows cold. The fire is almost spent, the candle a stub surrounded by wax like melted bone. One by one, the family drifts to their beds, hearts heavy and serene. The elder who told the first story remains seated, listening to the embers sigh. He swears, though he will never say it aloud, that he hears faint bells carrying across the distance, ringing for the dead who never truly left. Outside, the world stretches blank and silver under the moon. The icicles glitter like glass reliquaries, each containing a trapped moment of the night. For an instant, it feels as though time holds its breath, and all the centuries of Christmas ghost stories hover invisibly above the sleeping earth, like frost that remembers every rising dawn. These echoes by the hearth remind us why the tradition mattered. It was never just entertainment. It was communion, storytelling as survival. To speak of ghosts is to admit that love outlasts death, that memory endures beyond decay. When the Victorians spoke their tales into the dark, they were not summoning terror, but kinship. As you listen now through the veil of history, you too become part of that circle. The same impulse that drew them toward the fire draws you to stories still, seeking meaning in the uncertain, warmth in the cold. The modern screen may have replaced the flame, but the eyes that watch it are haunted by the same desire, to understand what lingers after the lights go out. And in that sense, the ghost story never truly died. It simply changed form, adapting to each new generation's solitude. Wherever a voice speaks softly in the dark, wherever one human heart tries to reach another across the gulf of time, the ghosts gather once more, unseen but attentive. They are listening, as they always have, to the fragile music of our need to remember. Because Christmas, stripped of its noise and commerce, is still a night of reckoning. It is still the hinge between endings and beginnings, still the point where we sit in the quiet and count the absences. To honor those who came before is the most human ritual of all. And so the telling continues. Firelight or no firelight, the candle lit within us. When the last ember fades and the world sinks once again into the hush that follows midnight, know that the ghosts are not gone. They are in our words, our grief, our laughter, our songs. They are the warmth we pass to each other in a universe of endless winter. In remembering them, we keep the oldest promise humankind ever made, to never let the darkness have the final word.